I caught my fiancé in bed with my brother, just 2 months before our wedding. They married after she got pregnant, but now, 3 years later, he's abandoned her, and somehow, my parents expect me to support her. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Lyla. At the time, I believed she was my forever. We had been together for nearly 5 years, both working as lawyers in demanding careers, yet always making time for each other. The year I proposed was supposed to be the happiest of our lives. Instead, it became the beginning of my worst nightmare. Lyla lost her job that year, let go under circumstances I won't get into, but let's just say it wasn't a graceful exit. For someone as ambitious as her, the loss was devastating. Her career wasn't just a job, it was part of her identity. Suddenly, she was unmoored, drowning in rejection as she struggled to find a new position. I did everything I could to support her. I assured her that money wasn't an issue, that I'd take care of us until she landed on her feet. I encouraged her to take a break, to breathe. Eventually, she took my advice, at least, I thought she did. She decided to pursue a long-time dream, pottery. She enrolled in a local class, something to occupy her time while she searched for new opportunities. I was happy she had found an outlet, a way to ease her stress. What I didn't realize was that my brother, Mason, was in that very same class. Mason and I were opposites. I was the responsible one, the straight-laced older brother who focused on school and career. Mason, on the other hand, had always been a reckless, carefree playboy, the kind of guy who never took relationships seriously. Lyla had known him for years and was well aware of his reputation, so when they started spending time together at pottery class, I saw no reason to worry. At first. Soon, Mason was driving her to and from class. She'd come home, gushing about the fun they had, showing me their pottery pieces like a kid showing off a school project. Then their time together started extending beyond class. They went to museums, tried new restaurants, things Lyla and I had always done together. Now, she was doing them with my brother instead. She started skipping date nights. She seemed more distant. The gut feeling that something was off gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, I confronted her. She was offended. She scoffed at the idea that anything was going on between her and Mason. She said it was just fun, light-hearted, like spending time with a younger sibling. She made me feel guilty for even questioning her, and for a moment, I believed her. But deep down, I knew better. 2 months before our wedding, I came home early from a business trip, eager to surprise her. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Mason's car parked outside. It was after 9 p.m. A strange sense of dread settled in my chest. I stepped inside quietly. The TV was on in the living room, but no one was there. My eyes drifted to the beer cans on the floor, then to the pile of clothes, Lyla's clothes. My stomach twisted. I already knew. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to spare myself the sight, but I needed to see it for myself. I walked down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last, my pulse roaring in my ears. I reached the bedroom and pushed the door open. There they were. Lyla and Mason, together, in my bed. So lost in each other they didn't even notice me standing there. Rage surged through me, white-hot and uncontrollable. I stepped forward, grabbed Mason by the back of his neck, and yanked him away from her. The look of pure terror on his face was almost satisfying. He stammered, scrambling for words, but there was nothing he could say that would ever make this right. I didn't even look at Lyla. I just walked away. I punched him square in the nose. The sickening crunch of bone filled the room, and for the briefest moment, a grim satisfaction settled over me. Blood gushed down his face, and he let out a pained cry, but I wasn't done. I hit him again, and again. Each punch landed harder than the last, fueled by the rage clawing at my chest. Mason stumbled backward, hands weakly trying to block me, but it was useless. I was beyond reason. When he finally crumpled to the floor, his face bloodied and bruised, I stepped back, breath heaving, hands shaking. Then I turned to Lyla. She sat frozen on the bed, eyes wide with terror, tears streaking her face. I met her gaze, my voice cold and unrecognizable, and said, "You have 10 minutes to get out of my house. If you don't, I won't hesitate to make you match him." She gasped, her body trembling. "Please," she whispered, "I can explain." I didn't care. I glanced at my watch. 9 minutes. The look in my eyes must have told her I wasn't bluffing because she scrambled off the bed. shaking hands grabbing for her clothes. She pulled a suitcase from the closet, stuffing it haphazardly with whatever she could grab. All the while, she sobbed, pleading with me, swearing she never meant to hurt me. I didn't respond. When she finally reached the front door, she turned one last time, her face streaked with desperation. "I love you," she choked out. "Please, please let me explain." I reached for her hand, slid my engagement ring off her finger, and shoved her toward the door. She stumbled onto the porch, still sobbing. I slammed the door shut. Her cries were muffled on the other side, but I didn't listen. Mason groaned from where he lay on the floor, blood still dripping down his face. As much as I wanted him gone, I wasn't about to let him die on my living room rug, so I did the only reasonable thing. I called my parents. When they arrived, my father was furious. My mother, on the other hand, immediately went into caretaker mode, fussing over Mason's injuries as if he were some helpless victim. I stood silently as she wiped the blood from his nose, cleaned the cuts on his face, and muttered worried words under her breath. Then Mason spoke. "I love her." I turned my head slowly, my rage reigniting. "She loves me too," he insisted, as if that made any of this okay. "This was the first time, we never meant to hurt you." Then he pulled out his phone. I read the messages, flirty texts, late-night confessions, Lyla pouring her heart out to him about how unhappy she was with me, and then the final blow, she was the one who invited him over that night, thinking I'd still be gone. I looked up at Mason, barely able to contain my fury. He kept talking, telling me he was sorry, telling me he hadn't meant for this to happen, but that he just couldn't stop himself. He begged for forgiveness, claiming he never felt this way about anyone before. My father had heard enough. He tore into Mason, his voice sharp with disappointment and disgust. But my mother, Mason's favorite, hesitated. She looked at him with pity, not anger, and then she turned to me and said, "You need to forgive him." I laughed bitterly. "You think I owe him forgiveness?" She nodded. "He's your brother. He regrets what he did. You can't hold on to this anger forever." I stared at her in disbelief. My father was silent, torn between his own frustration and my mother's desperate attempt at peace. I cut her off before she could say another word. "I don't want your lectures. Take him and leave." My father didn't argue. He helped Mason to the car while my mother lingered, looking back at me as if she could somehow fix this. When I didn't budge, she finally followed. In the weeks that followed, Lyla sent message after message, begging for another chance, spinning excuses that all sounded the same. I ignored every single one. Then one day, Mason called me. "She's pregnant." The words hit me like a wrecking ball. "The baby's mine," he continued, "and I want to marry her." Silence. Then the unthinkable, he asked for my blessing. I nearly laughed at the sheer audacity of it. My mother made it worse. She clung to the news like it was some divine sign, telling me it was all meant to be, that maybe Lyla was always destined for Mason. I told her exactly what I thought of her so-called destiny. I told her that if she sided with them, she would lose me. My father tried to remain neutral, but my mother was relentless. She offered Lyla financial support, ensuring she and the baby would be cared for. But, of course, there was a condition: Mason and Lyla had to get married. Mom pushed the marriage relentlessly, refusing to let her grandchild be born out of wedlock, and Mason, spineless as ever, went along with it. When the wedding invitations went out, I felt a fresh wave of fury, humiliation, betrayal. Without another word, I made my final decision. I was done with all of them. I kept my word and cut my mother and brother out of my life. But my mother doesn't give up easily. For weeks after the fallout, she called incessantly, left voicemails, and even showed up uninvited at my doorstep, pleading with me to reconcile. It was suffocating. That's when I realized the only way to escape her was to leave the city entirely. 3 years have passed since I packed up my life and moved to a new city, cutting ties with almost everyone in my family, except my dad. He respected my decision, though it saddened him that I no longer visited. He understood my need for distance. In those 3 years, I rebuilt my life. I didn't share my new number with anyone except my dad, and I trusted him to keep my whereabouts a secret unless something truly important came up. I found new friends, settled into my work, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. So, imagine my shock when I found Lyla on my doorstep yesterday. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. She was a far cry from the woman I had once loved. Her clothes were ragged, her face pale and gaunt, and her hair, once long and full, now looked thin and unkempt. She stood there, clutching a little girl's hand. The child couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old, and the resemblance to Mason was unmistakable. For a moment, I just stared. I had spent so long trying to forget her, to forget the pain she caused me, but in an instant, it all came rushing back. "Lyla, what are you doing here?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she trembled as she asked if she could come inside. She said there was something important she needed to discuss. I should have turned her away. I should have slammed the door and locked it, cutting the ties for good, but when I looked down at the little girl, with her wide, innocent eyes, something stopped me. I couldn't be rude in front of the child, so reluctantly, I stepped aside and let them in. I offered them water, but the silence between us was thick. Once they were settled, I sat across from them and asked again, "What do you want from me?" Lyla didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to me silently. My stomach twisted as I opened it. I recognized my mom's handwriting immediately. The letter was a demand. In no uncertain terms, she told me it was my responsibility to fix the mess Mason had created. She detailed how Lyla and Jesse were struggling, how Mason had abandoned them, and how, as Mason's brother and Jesse's uncle, it was my duty to step up and take care of them. I looked up at Lyla, my confusion turning to anger. "What is this supposed to mean?" I asked, holding up the letter. That's when she broke down. She told me everything. Mason had never been faithful to her, not even after Jesse was born. He had cheated throughout their entire marriage, and though she tried to hold it together for the sake of their daughter, it was never enough. 3 months ago, Mason had disappeared without a word, no explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Lyla had been left with nothing, no job, no savings, and no home. My mother, feeling obligated because of Jesse, had been giving Lyla money to keep them afloat, but now, with Mason gone for good, my mom had decided she no longer wanted to be responsible for them. Lyla told me that my mom wanted me to take care of her and Jesse. I was repulsed. I felt my blood boil as she spoke. How dare they think I would just step in and clean up after their mess? My mother, who had sided with Mason during the original betrayal, now wanted me to bear the weight of the consequences. It was maddening, but, honestly, it wasn't surprising. My mother's blind favoritism had always been obvious, and now it was just suffocating. I told Lyla, as firmly as I could, that she had no right to expect anything from me. This wasn't my child. She wasn't my fiancée anymore. This wasn't my problem. Though part of me felt sympathy for the child, how could I not? I wasn't about to let my mother or Lyla guilt-trip me into taking responsibility for a situation I didn't create. I asked them to leave. Lyla's tears started again. She pleaded with me, saying she had nowhere to go, that she had spent the last of her money on gas just to get here. I gave her a few $100, more to get her out of my house than out of any real sense of charity, and asked her again to leave. Since then, I've been wrestling with guilt. I know I did the right thing, but there's a nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me I should have done more for the child. But I can't keep cleaning up after people who've caused me so much pain. Update 1. Okay, I need to clarify a few things. My mother's behavior is honestly beyond baffling to me. The fact that she's trying to guilt me into helping Lyla and her child after everything that's happened is incredibly selfish. I get that she might feel some obligation to her grandchild, but this is not my responsibility. She should not expect me to fix Mason's mess, especially after the way she completely disregarded my feelings and sided with him during the betrayal. What really gets to me is how out of touch she is. She's actively trying to justify their actions as if everything would just go back to normal, as if I owe them. Some of you have pointed out that my dad wasn't much better. He may not have actively sided with my mom and Mason, but his neutral stance didn't exactly make me feel supported. He could have stood up to my mom's manipulation, but he didn't, and that, too, feels like a betrayal. I plan to have a serious conversation with my dad soon, but I know one thing for sure: Lyla may have been abandoned by Mason, but that doesn't make her my responsibility. She made her choices, and while I can sympathize with her situation, I don't owe her anything. When she showed up on my doorstep with nothing but a sob story and a child in tow, it only underscored how desperate she was. What I did, Telling Lyla to leave while offering her some money but not taking on any more responsibility was about setting boundaries. I didn't shut her out of spite. I made it clear that I'm not here to fix what Mason broke. It's not my job to take care of her just because she's struggling now. And no, that child is definitely not mine. Lyla and I broke up long before she got pregnant, and by the time we ended things, we hadn't been intimate for months. The timeline is crystal clear. There's no question in my mind that Mason is Jesse's father, not me. I don't need a paternity test. Jesse's features, her face, eyes, smile, are unmistakably Mason's. I'm not getting dragged into any more confusion over this. The child is his, and that's final. I refuse to be pulled into the mess any further. And no, I won't adopt my niece. I can't believe some of you even suggested it. Lyla is the mother, and it's her responsibility. I don't know why she didn't work or save during her marriage, but Mason is the father. Both of them need to step up. If anything, Mason should be paying child support, not expecting me to bail them out. Update 2. I finally talked to my dad about everything. I already knew he'd given Lyla my address, but I wanted to hear it from him directly. I called him and asked point blank why he agreed to share my location after I'd specifically asked him not to, and what he thought I was supposed to do for Lyla and her child after everything. He was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, before he sighed deeply and apologized. "I'm sorry, son, I really am," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We've tried everything we could to help Lyla. With Mason gone, we could only do so much. Your mom begged me to give her your address. She said maybe if you saw her after all this time, you'd want to help, since she has nowhere else to go." I could feel my frustration bubbling over. "Why would you think I'd help her?" I asked. "She betrayed me with Mason. She hurt me, and now you want me to help her?" My dad apologized again, saying that neither he nor my mom wanted things to turn out this way, but Lyla and Jesse were family to them. He believed I was their only option. I told him I was done. I had trusted him to be different from my mom, but they were both the same, backstabbing traitors. Did they really think I could forget everything, just welcome Lyla and Mason's child back into my life, and start taking care of them? It hit me, my parents really didn't care about me. I told him to lose my number and forget I ever existed, and I warned him that if he or my mom ever showed up at my door again, I would call the police. My dad tried to apologize again, but I wasn't interested. My voice didn't waver. I was resolute. "Don't call me again," I said, "just don't. You made your choices, and I'm making mine." I hung up, blocked his number, and never looked back. What he did was unforgivable. There's no coming back from this. Update 3. It's been almost a month since my last update. I was able to track down Mason with the help of a friend. Turns out, Lyla was right. Mason has been living with his latest fling a few towns away, pretending like he doesn't have any responsibilities, acting like his past doesn't exist. I can't believe this is the same guy who, 3 years ago, told me with a straight face that he was in love with Lyla, the same guy who turned my life upside down. Now, after everything, he's living with someone else, as if abandoning his wife and child was just a minor inconvenience. It made my blood boil. How could someone be so selfish, so cold? The fact that he was so casual about abandoning his own family like it was nothing was infuriating. Once I found out where he was, I forwarded the address to Lyla. I didn't want to get involved with her drama anymore, but I didn't want her to feel completely helpless, either. So, I gave her one last piece of advice. You need to hire a lawyer, file for divorce, and get child support. Do it now, before Mason disappears again. I also sent her some money, just enough to get by. Lyla thanked me, and I could hear the relief in her voice, but I wasn't interested in hearing her apologies anymore. "I'm done," I texted. "Don't contact me again. Don't show up at my door. This is the last thing I'm doing for you. Whatever we had, whatever it was, is long gone. I just want my peace, and I want her to respect that."